You mentioned this act in the early days where the Spanish king packed a ship with like 20 orphans that he used as inoculation factories over in the New World. I was just like, oh, just gave me chills.
Right. So exactly. So when you start thinking about this question of harvesting vaccine matter off of enslaved people's bodies, enslaved children and infants, because they're considered to be the most pure, because all the experimentation done by these Confederate doctors realized that soldiers are infected with they have other comorbidities. So it's actually compromising the vaccination process. So at first I'm looking at this case and I'm like, wait a minute, this is outrageous. And then I think, well, it's completely aberrant. It's just something that's happening in the American South as a result of slavery. And then exactly what you said, because the book is a global history, you raise that question within a global context and you find out that King Carlos the Fourth, I think it is, of Spain, begins a creates a royal expedition to transport vaccine matter from Spain to the Spanish Empire. So throughout the Caribbean and throughout the Spanish countries in South America. And he knows that he can't transport it safely on glass or even cloth. So he turns to the most subjugated population, and those are orphans. And they sort of begin this process of pairing the orphans two at a time and infecting them throughout the voyage, so that by the time they arrive in the Caribbean, that their bodies can now produce the lymph, which could be harvested from them in order to protect the people within the empire. So,
And these aren't just like clean little biopsies, they're like taking a freaking knife and like, digging out these pustules and
right. So the point is, like, this is actually a case. And I've went back to this case study. It's a case that actually MD, PhD first discovered and published about it in the Hispanic Studies Bulletin. So it's been around, but it's actually kind of, fascinating to sort of think about in light of our conversations about vaccination, because one, there's the point about we're delaying children from being vaccinated because we need to make sure it's safe. In the 18th and 19th century, children, they didn't care about safety. They didn't care about medical ethics. They thought that their health was, they were the healthiest of all the population. So they just used them. But the interesting thing is, I saw it as a form of exploitation. Other people that have written on it said, well, aren't these orphans lucky? Because they
Mm.
were, yeah, because they were being taken away from, they were being commissioned by the king to do this important work, and so they would have felt excited to get to be selected to be put on this journey. And that to me is just really stops you in your tracks. And
That's some really good marketing right there.
Is this like King
right, I think
Carlos's like great great grandson writing?
right. But yeah, to me, it's a horrific, awful practice, just for all of the ways that you describe in the procedure and the idea of getting sick. But again, as a historian, I see it within the context of what they did to enslaved children. And I see it as a pattern of subjugation and violence. That's how I view it as a historian.
And it seems like it reveals a wider pattern of these epidemics affecting the most I don't know a better way of saying it, but really affecting people who have been subjugated since the beginning. Like the way they even discovered this idea that there was some infectious miasma really came down to crowded situations, prisons. Like you mentioned something too that was just amazing. It was like before the advent of the hospital as we know it, poor people and sick people were basically treated as the same population at any given time. And I was like, that's freaking wild.
Right. So I mean, let me just all right. So let me touch on this. Let me address this point about poor people and sick people. Eh, but let me just circle back really quickly to about the children, because I want to say one thing as a historian, and this is what I think is really important. We don't have, it hasn't appeared, maybe it will appear. We don't have the archival evidence of the first person testimony of these children to say whether or not they thought this was like they were appointed by the king and this was something to be celebrated. We have evidence that some of their foster families and some of their families in Spain thought this was a good thing. But we don't have the first person testimony. So as a historian, it's like really hard to you don't want to cast judgment, but as you said, it seems to follow in this pattern of subjugation. And what we know about the procedure, it seems violent. The other thing is, and this is really kind of, you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about poor people and sick people in hospitals, because ultimately, the notion that we are born and we die in a hospital, and a hospital can be a therapeutic space, a curative space, that's a relatively recent phenomenon of the 20th century. Hospitals before the 20th century were basically shelters for the dispossessed. They seem to me to look more on what we would refer to as soup kitchens and homeless, shelters. And so they were for people that often didn't have families. They were for people who suffer from a range of disorders. There were things from everything from, children who were orphaned in hospitals and asylums to people who suffered from mental disabilities and physical disabilities. And so what we know historically is that a lot of times historians would say, oh, the virus originated among the poor. It started with the poor. And that's been well documented by lots of historians. What I'm trying to say is, how did doctors learn from the poor? Because ultimately you had physicians who entered into those hospitals and into those environments that wanted to understand how infection was spreading. And so what I argue in the book is that the slave trade, colonialism, and empire create all of these new control groups, all of these new ways of sort of studying infection. And there's a buy-in by the governments to sort of think about what's happening in terms of the spread of infection, because it affects their profit, it affects the empire, it affects war. But prior to that, in these hospitals, in these asylums and almshouses, medical reformers were identifying specific disorders like jail fever to those locations. But these were populations that most people didn't care about. So there were doctors saying, listen, crowded conditions lead to the spread of disease. But you're talking about a population that most people didn't care about. Now you go to slavery and you talk about the transatlantic slave trade, and you're crowding human beings in an unprecedented number at the bottom of ships. All of a sudden, people are now becoming interested in this because there's a economic investment in terms of what their health is. And there's also, as I mentioned in the book, there's a bureaucracy. There's a military bureaucracy that's now recording it. So say, for example, a doctor in a poor section of London or Paris or even Philadelphia is noticing the spread of infection in a hospital. Where's that going? I mean, this is at a time where there were some medical journals, but the American Medical Association, the professional organizations were just sort of developing. So there's no place really for that to go. Now, there's no forum really. I mean, some of my early modern historians would come up screaming at me like, no, there was the Society of blah, blah. I get it. So there's probably some places in different times you have that. But I want to think about, what does a colonial or military bureaucracy do to streamline that information? So military bureaucracy is very detailed oriented. These doctors are incredibly fastidious. So now when these doctors are aboard a ship and they're witnessing the rates of infection, they are obligated to record what they're seeing and talk about what they're seeing. And so their bureaucracy actually facilitates the process of scientific knowledge production, because what happens is those reports eventually flow back to the metropole. And now doctors have in the metropole, and military officials have in the metropole, a bird's eye view of seeing an epidemic in a way that they hadn't before.